Okay, welcome everybody. Can people hear me? Yes? Great. Welcome, and thank you for your patience. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this event organized by the Amsterdam Research Center for Gender and Sexuality, ARC-GS as we call it, as part of the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research, and of course, together also with this the beautiful location in the heart of Amsterdam, SPUI25. My name is Sarah Brakke, and I hold the chair of Sociology of Gender and Sexuality at the University of Amsterdam, and I direct the Amsterdam Research Center for Gender and Sexuality together with Julie McBrien. ARC-GS is a research community, and we seek to bring together scholars and scholarship on gender and sexuality within the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research. And this is a community shaped by many differences in disciplinary contexts and traditions, different theoretical and epistemological approaches, different methodologies, and also differences in the emphasis on gender or sexuality in one's research. And we are committed to making this an expansive community where the differences provide fertile ground for conversation and new ways of thinking. We currently have two different lecture or webinar series, Thinking Through the Crises, which engages with different kinds of contemporary crises that we are faced with and explores the gender and sexuality dimension of these crises. And then, what we're doing today, Research in Focus, which focuses on new, exciting research. And of course, there's an overlap between the crises and the new, exciting research. So check out our website, also our active PhD community, join the newsletter to stay connected to what we do. Now, as a research community, we bring scholars together for more than 10 years now. But of course, in the past year and a half, this bringing together took drastically different forms in a pandemic world. And I think that both the urgency of community was more felt, and at the same time, it was more difficult to organize this community. As we're slowly moving back to be able to engage with each other in real life, and today is an especially joyous moment for that. There's many of us here. Of course, the people at home don't see all these happy smiley faces. I think there's 60 or 70 of us here. I do want to acknowledge some of the ways in which the pandemic conditions have shaped our activities. As last academic year, all of our scholarly encounters were online, were webinars, all of them. But as that happened, these encounters got more conversational, shorter presentations, shorter in relation to our classic public lectures before the pandemic, which were 50 minutes, an hour of lecture. So we've moved to shorter presentations and more interactions. And this might be among some of the pandemic practices that we would actually like to keep. Also, these online encounters were recorded and then posted on the ASSR YouTube channel, watched by many after the event. And also that is something that we would like to keep. So also this event is recorded and welcoming the people who are watching through the live stream and will be available to watch or rewatch afterwards. So we find ourselves in this hybrid situation with many of you here physically with us, and then some of you many of you through the live stream, and welcome to all. This is our 4th edition of Research in Focus, and it's a pleasure to be able to focus today on a new book, and let me just show this beauty, on a new book by the political theorist Rahul Rao, Out of Time, The Queer Politics of Postcoloniality. The book came out with Oxford University Press in 2020, the pandemic year, and so this is actually the first book presentation or book celebration, we can call it, in real life. And we are very pleased to be able to host that in Amsterdam. Now, in Out of Time, Rahul Rao investigates the impact and the memory of the colonial encounter on the politics of sexuality and religiosity and on contemporary homophobic moral panics. And so this afternoon, Rahul Rao will trace the encounters and the entanglements across geopolitical divides that produce and contest contemporary queer phobias. Let me briefly introduce the speaker. So Rahul Rao is a lecturer in international political thought at the University of St. Andrews and currently a fellow at the NIAS here in Amsterdam. Beside Out of Time, he is also the author of Third World Protest, Between Home and the World, which was also published by the Oxford University Press. He is a member of the Radical Philosophy Collective and blogs occasionally at The Disorder of Things. After Rahul's presentation, we have two members of the ArcGS community who have been eagerly reading Rahul's work and who will respond and engage in conversation. We have Sruti Bala, who is Associate Professor in Theatre and Performance Studies at the UvA. She coordinates a 5-year research project on gender and sexual citizenship in the Dutch Caribbean in cooperation with the University of Curaçao. And she recently published The Gestures of Participatory Art with Manchester University Press in 2018. And was co-editor with a Tellis of the Global Trajectories of Queerness, Same-Sex Politics in the Global South. And then we have Rachel Spronk, or Rachel Spronk, is Associate Professor in Development of in the Department of Anthropology at the UvA. Her various research projects evidence a concern with historical trajectories that have shaped the present, the production of knowledge about gender and sexuality, and ultimately how the lived experience of people informs our theoretical models. Overall, she investigates the interface between sexuality and middle classes in Ghana and Kenya, examining problematic assumptions behind both terms. She was a co-editor with T. Hendricks of Readings in Sexualities from Africa, published with Indiana University Press in 2020. So without further ado, I will give the floor to our Speaker of Honor, Rahul Rao, and he will present this beautiful book. I will leave the book here, right? We should have a little stand that holds the book here. So he will present the book, and after that we will have engagements and conversations with Sruti and Rahul. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for coming here. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, great. Thanks to RGS and to SPUI, which I think I'm mispronouncing, but I will learn how to say it over the next 10 months. And thanks especially to Sarah and Julie, Rachel and Shruti for agreeing to be in conversation. This is a really special event for me because my editor got in touch with me in March 2020 to say that the book was out and put it in the mail and sent it to SOAS, where I was working at the time. And the very next day, things shut down for most of the next 18 months. So I've done several talks about the book, but all of them have been on Zoom. This is the first face-to-face conversation I'm having, which is both exciting and slightly nerve-wracking. So I am not feeling particularly practiced at introducing the book, but we'll give it a shot. There are many different ways, I think, of describing what the book tries to do. And I, at the beginning of the book, outlined 3 ways in which it might be read. I'm sure there are more ways in which it could be read, but this is what occurred to me towards the end of writing the manuscript. So in the first place, the book is a study of the global reverberations of the Uganda Anti-Homosexuality Act, which it also puts in conversation with queer struggles in India and queer preoccupations, let me use that word, in Britain. So really it's a book about the afterlives of British imperialism as they manifest themselves in 3 different places, and in the ways in which the afterlives of colonialism might matter to contemporary queer political protest. So the Uganda Anti-Homosexuality Act, which many of you may have heard of, drew worldwide attention when it was first introduced in the Ugandan parliament, for, I think, a couple of reasons. One was the draconian nature of some of the punishments it proposed. It proposed to enhance already existing punishments in the Ugandan Penal Code for same-sex sexual conduct. The other was the very well-documented involvement of mostly US-based Christian evangelicals in lobbying Ugandan politicians and priests to introduce this kind of legislation. Now, many of us who work in queer studies have been deeply influenced by Jaspir Puar's terrorist assemblages, and in particular her unpacking of the notion of homonationalism, which is a phenomenon that is probably very well understood in the Netherlands, where LGBT rights has become central to the identity of the nation state, and more generally where LGBT rights has begun to be seen as a marker of civilization, a way to distinguish the civilized from the barbarian. A new marker, if you like, for an age-old Orientalist divide, to use Edward Said's term. So I expected that the very well-documented involvement of American evangelical Christians in this particular episode of homophobia would mean that it would not be amenable to homo-nationalist rhetorics. I was very quickly proved wrong, because of course this is a crisis that was unfolding in sub-Saharan Africa, which has long been framed in Orientalist terms. I don't need to remind anyone of that. And this wasn't anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa. This was in Uganda, geographically contiguous to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, etc. And so, sure enough, the Heart of Darkness metaphors and stereotypes became the way in which Uganda was presented to the world as the world's worst place to be gay, quote unquote, to use the title of an early BBC documentary on this story. Now, of course, all of this was very rightly critiqued by critics of homonationalism, who, including myself, who use Poir's work to draw attention to the racist, colonialist logics by which this particular crisis was being framed. But I also found troubling some of the liberal responses to homonationalism in this case, which seemed to displace agency for the Uganda Anti-Homosexuality Act entirely onto the Americans, as if the Ugandans had no agency in this particular situation. This I found, many Ugandans found this patronizing as well. So Sylvia Tamale, for example, was one of the earliest voices saying, what about the Ugandan agency in this particular story? So the challenge, I thought, became one of drawing attention to Ugandan agency in the production of political homophobia without resorting to the Orientalist homonationalist tropes that were typically being used to describe this particular situation. I try and do this in the book. I'm not sure how far I succeed, but I try and do this by drawing attention to a series of transactions between elites in the pre-colonial kingdom of Buganda, which becomes the state of Uganda, as well as in the post-colonial state of Uganda, and various Western interlocutors, both in the late 19th century and in the early 21st century moment in which we're looking at this problem. And that requires me to trace a series of such transactions and encounters between the Kingdom of Buganda and British colonialism, between the different provinces of the Anglican Church, which was very central. The politics of Anglican Christianity were very central to this particular episode. Between donors of the Ugandan state, including the World Bank and the state itself, and of course between LGBT activists in the global South and North. And what I try and do is to demonstrate that the production of homophobia is the result of a series of transactions and collaborations across these geopolitical divides that draw in actors from different places, often for very different reasons, but who converge or come together for particular purposes that manifest themselves in the shape of legislations like the Uganda Anti-Homosexuality Act. In some ways, the book is very indebted to Neville Hoad's African Intimacies, but it's less reliant on a study of purely colonial discourse analysis, and it's much more interested in the contemporary, in the way in which we today make sense of the past, or deploy the past, or draw it into contemporary political debates. Now, of course, many Ugandan scholars and activists were writing about this contemporaneously. People like Stella Nyanzi, for example, who will be in Amsterdam next semester. Also, Andrew Karamagi, Deborah Kintu wrote a book-length account of the Anti-Homosexuality Act. My own contribution, I think, is to draw attention to the global reverberations of this crisis, rather than to what was going on specifically within Uganda. And here I was very inspired by Anat Singh's book on friction, global friction, her account of what she calls an ethnography of global connection. Her particular interest is in studying deforestation in Indonesia, but she tells a much bigger global story, and I was trying to do something similar in this book. Now, central to the global frictions I'm interested in is, of course, the interpellative force of homonationalism. But my argument here is that the civilizationist tropes of homonationalism, where we're invited to contrast the civilized and the barbarian, have to be supplemented with the political economy logic of what I call homocapitalism. I think it's precisely because the critique of homonationalism has been so successful, intellectually successful, even if not politically successful, that queer liberalism is changing the way in which it operates, the way in which it seeks to persuade recalcitrant states and societies that they ought to recognize LGBT rights. So what we see now, I think, is alongside the resort to the shaming language of civilization and barbarism, a different kind of discourse. Right? Alongside is important, because I'm not arguing that homonationalism has disappeared. I'm arguing that we need to see its supplementary logic in this thing I call homocapitalism. Actually, I'm not even the inventor of that term. It was floating around on Twitter, and I felt like it was a very good description for what I was seeing in this particular case. One of the first and most influential reactions to the Uganda Anti-Homosexuality Act came from the World Bank, which postponed and eventually cancelled a loan that was intended to have funded maternal health projects in Uganda, a kind of punishment for the Anti-Homosexuality Act. You could call this perhaps the first instance of gay conditionality. This idea was subsequently taken up by other state elites. David Cameron, in a somewhat ill-judged interview, said that aid would now be made conditional on respect for LGBT rights. The World Bank, around the same time, pioneered a series of studies which purported to demonstrate that if a country recognized LGBT rights, its GDP would grow by X%. And if it de-recognized certain rights, its GDP would shrink by a certain percentage. So in this way, capital was being used as both carrot and stick. Right? Carrot as inducement to persuade states to change their laws, but also stick, withdrawn when they fail to do so, or worse. I think that what's important about this shift in the strategies of queer liberalism is that the phenomenon of homocapitalism relies more on consent than coercion. Again, coercion hasn't disappeared, but it is supplemented with a much more consensual logic. And what I mean by that is when a state or a society is told that it is barbaric and that to be civilized it ought to do something else, it is open to those states and societies, as many of them have done, to say that what you call barbarism is our version of civilization. In other words, that kind of rhetoric has been countervailed by a civilizationist logic that simply refuses the terms of the argument. But when confronted with the suggestion that in order for a state or a society to be more prosperous, they ought to go in a certain direction, specifically recognize LGBT rights, that kind of argument is much harder to resist. And this is because of the hegemony of neoliberal reason and of course, of global capitalism. And this is why I would suggest that while homocapitalism relies on hegemony for its persuasiveness, homonationalism is a strategy of dominance. I'm using the difference that Ranajit Guha, Subaltern Studies founder, makes between dominance and hegemony, and he in turn is using Gramsci's understanding of those concepts. So this is one level, perhaps, on which the book can be read, as a book about the global frictions of homosexuality and anti-homosexuality as it played out in this particular context. Now, as I move the scene of action in the book from one set of encounters to another, I noticed that the way in which institutions were talking about sexuality seemed to shift. So there are different chapters in the book that focus on, for example, the World Bank or the British state or the Indian state. And in each of these chapters, the way in which sexuality is framed seems to shift from race to class to caste. And so I became very intrigued by the phenomenon of how sexuality came to be lived through different modalities. And I'm using Stuart Hall's language here for Stuart Hall's understanding of race has lived through, class has lived through the modality of race. And this is a way of thinking about how sexuality might be lived through other modalities. whether of nation or religiosity or class or caste or whatever. And so in this second way of framing the book, what I'm trying to do is to offer a revisiting of intersectionality. And I do this by going to some of the original texts that gave us that term, specifically Kimberly Crenshaw. And I read Kimberly Crenshaw in a way that I think encourages us to move away from the visual metaphor of the crossroads, which has become the kind of visuality through which we understand intersectionality, to something a little bit different. Specifically, I think the visual metaphor of the crossroads invites us to think of axes such as sex and race as separable from one another. This is, in part, Poir's critique of intersectionality. But this is not what Crenshaw argues, right? So in Crenshaw's argument, the axes are not sex distinguished from race. Really, what she's interested in are the ways in which gender as a category is understood in ways that privilege the experiences of white women, and race as a category is understood in ways that privilege the experiences of black men. What happens to black women when these kinds of categories are brought into conversation with each other? That's the question that Crenshaw asks us. So my reading of Crenshaw is that the axes are not sex and race distinguished from each other, but white women and black men, right? So in that sense, both axes are already invisibly intersectional, to use Anna Karastatis's term. I also read Crenshaw alongside B.R. Ambedkar, who will be familiar to many of you, some of you maybe less so. Ambedkar is the leading Dalit visionary and intellectual in the Indian subcontinent, a global thinker of hierarchy, specifically around caste, the architect of India's constitution. He's remembered in all of these different ways. In a very influential paper on caste, where Ambedkar is searching for a definition for caste, he ultimately offers a definition that suggests that caste is inseparable from the regulation of gender and sexuality. So caste can only be understood through the regulation of gender and sexuality, and vice versa. Gender can only be understood through the regulation of caste. And this makes me wonder whether the visual metaphor of a Mobius strip, where categories become one another, might be a more compelling way to capture Crenshaw's insight into what intersectionality is. So this is not so much an innovation as a juxtaposed rereading of several of the critical originary texts on intersectionality, as a way of, I think, getting us away from liberal understandings of intersectionality as the crossroads towards something closer to what the progenitors of these concepts, I think, intended. But the third level on which the book proceeds is, it is a book about time, as the title of the book suggests. And so in the remainder of my remarks, I'll focus on this particular level on which the book operates. How much time do I have, Sarah? Yeah? Okay. So I actually had some slides that they're not working, right? Okay. So I'll try and summarize this as best as I can. So the queer theoretical literature on temporality has, and this might be familiar to you, several texts such as Heather Love's Feeling Backward, Elizabeth Freeman's work on erotohistoriography in her famous book Time Binds, Lee Edelman's No Future, Jose Munoz's Cruising Utopia. One of the things that struck me about this literature is it's very invested in temporal orientation and reorientation. Just think about some of the titles of these books: Feeling Backwards, No Future, Catherine Bond Stockton's Growing Sideways. This queer theoretical literature on temporality is very invested in direction. And that made me wonder whether it made me curious about why queer theory literature on temporality has been so invested in redirecting the arrow of time, if you like. There's also a certain confidence to this literature. It seems quite sure about where LGBT movements should look temporally for more progressive futures. And I found that much more difficult to articulate, perhaps because I wasn't looking at any one particular queer movement. Many of these books take as their point of departure the US LGBT movement. and are offered as a critique of the temporal politics of that movement. This is also a reminder, I think, of how much of queer theory comes out of American studies. So if we want to take the global queer political presence seriously, then we might perhaps need to think in terms of what post-colonial theorists like Dipesh Chakrabarty have called heterotemporality. So Chakrabarty does this in one of his most well-known books, Provincializing Europe, which is a critique of history writing. He's particularly interested here in liberal and Marxist historiography, and his argument is that these histories are basically telling a history of capital, which means that in writing history, they are attentive to those aspects of the life world that contribute to the reproduction of capital. And that means that any aspect of the life world that doesn't contribute to the reproduction of capital is seen as archaic, as a relic of the past. It drops out of history. It's something that doesn't belong in time. It's still there, but it doesn't quite belong. He's arguing that what we need is a mode of relating to the past that is able to bring what he calls history one, the hegemonic mode of history writing, into conversation with other ways of thinking about the past, which he places under the sign of history two. Memory, for example, is a different way of relating to the past that he asks us to think about. So I wanted to pick up this strategy and to think about the ways in which queer movements might relate to the past in ways that do not rely purely on the hegemonic modes of history writing. When looking at queer political controversies in the global south, and I'm thinking of both India and Uganda here, we often confront a very powerful discourse from cultural conservatives, which begins and ends with the claim that, and I quote, homosexuality is Western. Right? This is the claim that cultural conservatives often make. And queer activists are often compelled to or tempted to respond with the counterclaim that it is homophobia that's Western. And that counterclaim is articulated by pointing to colonial penal legal codes, which have left behind legal legacies that one sees in the Uganda Penal Code or the Indian Penal Code, or indeed to the contemporary politics of homophobia, such as the one imported by US evangelical activists into the Ugandan context. So you have these two statements battling each other. Homosexuality is Western, homophobia is Western. For me, both statements are true, but they're also somewhat evasive. So think about the statement, homosexuality is Western. It's made by cultural conservatives, but in a certain sense, it's also made by Foucault in The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, right? The claim that homosexuality as a discourse originates in a particular place and time. Now, of course, the politics of Foucault and the cultural conservatives is very different, even if they converge on this particular statement. So the sentence, homosexuality is Western, is true, but it's also evasive. When it doesn't quite acknowledge other kinds of same-sex practices that are not amenable to being framed within the logic of sexuality, or forms of desire that may not even be a sexual practice. The counter statement, homophobia is Western, again, true enough as an account of the provenance of these legal provisions that we're looking at. Yes, colonial legal codes do have a legacy that we see in contemporary penal codes. But it leaves open the question of whether pre-colonial forms of queerphobia existed. We don't even ask the question. Right? There's a tendency to begin the story with the colonial moment and to read post-colonial politics as entirely a legacy of the colonial moment. In the South Asian context, this is particularly problematic when we're thinking about caste, which is, of course, a pre-colonial formation that is altered in some important ways by colonialism, but that then goes on to have very powerful post-colonial formations and legacies. So how do we relate to the past in a way that doesn't lapse into a nostalgia for the pre-colonial, that is also attentive to the force of the colonial, and that can make sense of the post-colonial as some complex amalgam of all of these different influences? This is, in a sense, the memory section of the book. I'm also interested in futurity because I use Marx and Freud as an inspiration for thinking about the ways in which the present is also inflected by anticipations of futurity. What kinds of futurity have we talked about in queer theory and queer politics? We've mostly talked about the sort of liberal hegemonic trajectory of futurity. But is the futurity of queer liberalism the only kind of futurity on offer? Are there other kinds of utopian futurities that we can see here? To make this a little bit less abstract, I'm just going to give you a very brief flavor of 4 of the chapters in 2 minutes each, so I'm not going to go into much detail here. There are 2 chapters that look at memory politics. The first of these looks at a story, a very well-known story in the Ugandan context, a story of the last pre-colonial ruler, Kabaka Mwanga, who is believed to have had sex with men in his court. And the word sex is in scare quotes for various reasons. We don't quite know what happened because the only documents we have are Christian missionary sources. We know from the work of Sylvia Nanyonga Tamusuza that the Baganda saw gender and sexuality very differently in the 19th century than Christian missionaries at the time did. So much of what happened is shrouded in a sort of epistemological misunderstanding. But in any case, the hegemonic version of the story is that the king had sex with men in his court till the Christian missionaries arrived, converted them to Christianity, at which point they learned that these practices are a sin. They refuse the king his advances. He has them put to death for their disloyalty in a very public series of executions in 1885-86. The Catholic Church begins a campaign to canonize these early martyrs to Christianity, and after several decades, in the 1960s, the then Pope declares the 23 martyred Catholics to be saints. So these people are now remembered as the Uganda martyrs. There is a Uganda Martyrs' Day on the 3rd of June, when hundreds of thousands of pilgrims congregate at shrines near present-day Kampala to remember these events. And so the question for me, or the premise of this part of the project, is to ask, how can memory of this story coexist with the claim that same-sex desire is culturally inauthentic and alien to the Ugandan context? Another memory chapter shifts the focus to Britain. There is an increasing awareness in British LGBT circles that anti-queer laws in many parts of the Commonwealth are a legacy of British colonial penal codes. What responsibility does this impose on Britain and British activists in this particular moment? This has led to a very curious discourse of atonement, where British politicians at the highest levels of British politics have fallen over each other to say sorry for colonialism because of its toxic legacies as they manifest themselves in anti-queer laws. So I read a 2012 debate in the House of Commons and the House of Lords where white gay conservative law lords, one after the other, stand up to say sorry for colonialism. It's very peculiar because when you juxtapose this with debates in 2007 on the bicentenary of the commemoration of the abolition of slavery, that is not what you hear from the House of Commons or the House of Lords. Instead, you get a series of very complicated arguments about how it is difficult, if not impossible, to apologize for colonialism because it happened too long ago, because it would cost too much, although that's not said very loudly. And of course, race is doing a huge amount of work here. Right? So this part of the project is trying to think about how sexuality is understood by these British elites through the modality of race, and what that means for their willingness to atone for or to reckon with colonialism. Here I'm very interested in the work on memory and haunting by Avery Gordon, Saidiya Hartman, Jacques Derrida. But what I try and add to this is that haunting doesn't happen automatically. The ghosts are not just there, right? It requires a kind of labor. It requires the labor of activists to make those ghosts visible, to make them haunt the present. And conversely, a huge amount of labor is put in by white cultural conservatives to push those ghosts away, to make them not visible. So I'm trying to illuminate in this section the labor of spectral work, the labor of haunting, the work that goes into making these ghosts visible or invisible, and the ways in which memory thereby becomes a battleground for contemporary politics. The last two chapters look at futurity. In the first of these, I look at the ways in which homo-capitalism promises a certain kind of future. It's a future in which queers become model capitalist subjects in waiting. If only they were recognized, the GDP would grow in the ways I've described before. This is a discourse that is not just top-down. It is not just produced by the World Bank. It is, again, a transactional, collaborative, discursive production in which elite LGBT activists in places like in India, certainly, are very much involved. It's a strategy of upward mobility pursued by LGBT activists, where inclusion within the structures of nation-state capital becomes the vehicle for liberation. And I contrast this in the final chapter with a very different vision of futurity that trans activists in India have used, in particular in a 2014 legal case, National Authority of Legal Services, NALSA versus Union of India, where trans activists were asking the Supreme Court for recognition as a backward class in the Indian context. Now, this will sound very odd to many people who are not familiar with Indian constitutional law and politics. Why would anyone want to be declared backward? The term backwardness has lots of negative associations with belatedness, with arrested development, etc. But backward in the Indian context, especially in the legal lexicon, is a term that subordinate castes have used to win recognition for their particular status, to win recognition of the history of oppression that has relegated them to a certain status, and thereby to access affirmative action. So it's a term that has been appropriated and re-signified by especially Dalit politics. It is not the term that radical Dalit politics uses, but it is the term that Indian law uses as a result of a series of compromises and debates that I describe in that particular chapter. So the history of the word backwardness is interesting and vexed and complicated, but it's marked by a very specific history in this context. Now, my argument here, and I try and do this particularly by reading trans autobiographies in the Indian context or life writing, is to suggest that this desire for backward class status is not just a pragmatic move to avail of affirmative action, although it is that too. In some trans narratives, it's also about a politics of breaking caste. It's an anti-caste politics that enters into the spirit of Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste, which is the title of his most famous essay. So this is a different politics of futurity, which doesn't aspire to a kind of upward mobility, but instead makes common cause with those at the bottom of the social ladder through analogy, but also intersection and emulation of those groups, and a desire to join those groups in a kind of radical anti-caste, anti-Hindu right politics in the contemporary neoliberal Hindu dispensation that rules the Indian state. So let me try and wrap this up, not so much by offering a conclusion. The book is not a temporal manifesto in the style of a lot of queer theory on temporality. It doesn't say we have to move forwards or backwards or not look forwards or sideways. I don't feel able to do that precisely because of the multiple locations of the book. But also, I think I'm more interested in a kind of anthropology of time, and in illuminating how both past and future, memory and futurity, are battlegrounds, ambivalent battlegrounds. They don't offer straightforward potential for liberation. They can take both conservative and radical forms. And I think I'm trying to situate and illustrate, to show what is at stake in talking about time and temporality in queer political protest. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Congratulations on this really very careful, very thoughtful, very precisely argued study. I'm not sure timely is the right word in the light of the way you have actually unpacked or conceptualized temporality, but definitely speaks to, it resonates with a broad range of questions around sexuality, race, the nation state and the colonial past and present, also in this country. I think the way you have connected queer politics in Uganda, India, and the UK is very, very convincing. It's not just some sort of comparative exercise for the sake of having different locales or doing, for the sake of comparison, but it really goes deep into the historical, psychic, political ties that have been formational to these sites. And at the same time, it makes this kind of wide horizon that looks at the supranational institutions, policies that are underpinning their formation. I'd say at a methodological level, I find the book really helpful in the way you first sketch a well-known, widely circulating idea, or you describe a historical event, and then you say, wait a minute. And you actually slow it down. What's going on over here? You slow down the associative moves that often tend to make for a convenient but lazy argument, and you're examining the affective politics of this idea or the event. And that to me was an interesting methodological, epistemological takeaway from the book. So when you say, oh yeah, what's going on, you're asking what is going on here when conservative post-colonial national governments declare homosexuality to be Western, or they uphold a heteronormative national image as an expression of anti-coloniality or self-determination. What is going on over here? What is going on when queer activists in the global south in turn proclaim homophobia to be Western? What's going on when Western nation states bend over backwards to publicly perform their progressive sexual values and to sort of help out former colonies get rid of the colonial laws that criminalize homosexuality? So I feel the book is really interesting to read in the way that it looks for the questions that are lurking behind these questions. It's all well and good to say that colonialism is responsible for criminalizing so-called deviant sexual practices, but how do we account for how the Ugandan church or Hindutva forces are so receptive to this idea? And how come there is some kind of a decolonial homophobia as well? You actually use that term. So you're kind of looking for the questions that seem to be asked or the statements that seem to be made, and what is lost, what is left out of this equation, and what would it mean to look at it from a kind of slower, more historicized and more transnational angle as well. The answers you offer, like you said in conclusion, are really not that simple to just summarize in 1, 2, 3 bullet points. They look at different spatial, temporal realities. They move in both affirmative and counter-affirmative directions. So in one moment, the answer serves one purpose, and in another moment, it serves another. That complicates things, but I think it also made it really makes the whole issue so interesting. I found this really one of the important things for me to take away in how you spend time with a question, letting the question sort of open out to several other background questions, which then complicate that question itself. So as a theatre scholar, I really also appreciated the place you gave to performance and more generally to the imaginative realms in your critique. So from the Carol Churchill plays that sort of bookend the prologue, epilogue, to many different references to film, performance, literature, and the surprising ways that these cultural expressions go straight to the heart of a certain debate or reflect on them in a different temporal mode. that helps the reader as well understand your grappling with temporality. So yeah, actually overall as a reader, I felt I was not really given much opportunity to disagree with you. Because you do all this very careful intellectual labor of working through the various contestations of an idea and interrogate the biases around them. So in terms of questions posing to you, I don't think I have a real challenging question, which would make for a nice book discussion, but I would like you to elaborate on some things which I thought were intriguing, and maybe in speaking about them we can get somewhere further temporal idea. So the first question is about your hesitation around the word phobia. So you rightly point out that homophobia or even queer phobia is not really appropriate or adequate, because the affect is not simply fear, but it's a kind of you call it an explosive amalgam of desire and antipathy, including self-hatred that comes from desiring what one is supposed to disavow. Of course, psychoanalytical theory has given us a lot of this type of understanding as well. Feminist theory or two. But you also sort of supplement homophobia with, but at the same time you say, nonetheless, for practical, strategic and other reasons, you will use that term. So I get that part. But still, what happens with this hesitation around the word phobia? And I found like, so you supplement homophobia with homo-capitalism and homo-romanticism, this thing about like, the homosexual life, pre-colonial homosexual life, and at the same time homo-capitalism, the queer liberal move on different levels. So I wonder if you're actually trying to say that homophobia is inadequate because it's also a combination of all of this. Nationalism, romanticism, capitalism coming together. And you also seem to be saying that homophobia is shaped, it's kind of fitted into a mold that is already given or already been set by other factors like racism or caste, or also gender divides. So for example, like the explanation given by people you interviewed in Uganda that homosexuality was introduced by the Arabs is in fact a kind of layering of a racist trope with gender and a sexualized trope. So these two things, the fact that homophobia is fear, desire, and all kind of complication of those things, it is also combination of homo-romanticism, capitalism, all this. And at the same time, there is a sort of, it comes in, it doesn't come into a void, it comes into something that's already happened. So maybe you can talk about this relation between all this around phobia. And the second question, you already actually explained it quite nicely now in the introduction, now when you spoke, is about your rereading of intersectionality away from the crossroads idea towards Mobius strip taken from Elizabeth Gross, and with reference to definition of caste by B.R. Ambedkar. Now, so what I struggle with, or I would like you to help me understand, is Ambedkar, maybe first of all you could explain this, caste is endogamy, a little bit more, also for the audience here unfamiliar with this. But when you're actually using this to analyze a case of trans politics in the Nalsa judgment case. So in fact you are saying that caste, I find it interesting that you say in Ambedkar there is a kind of Mobius way of reading caste, because caste is endogamy. So it's because endogamy allows for, only endogamy allows for, if caste is related to birth, then endogamy ensures that those who are born into a particular caste will always remain in that caste. So how do you make the transfer from endogamy to non-reproductive sexual worlds? So in some ways you are almost saying that queerness is the opposite of endogamy or something like this. Am I right? I don't know. But you also show that queerness is not just that. So you can't turn it around and say, you can't conversely say that wherever endogamy has been overcome, caste has been overcome. So maybe you could talk a bit about this. And finally, this is more out of curiosity, and I will end there, is I had a sense that you're really pretty critical about the queer movement in India. And also you differentiate many more different groups and caste and class allegiances, and you're much more empathetic to the Kuchus in Uganda. And but I'm curious to know, is there a resonance of sort of similar divides in Uganda amongst the activist queer movement, if you can call it that? Or can you generally talk about your observations about the activist movements in Uganda and in India? So I think I'll leave that with these questions and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Should I follow up on it or first have Rahul respond?
Maybe follow up. Is that okay?
Yeah? Okay, so then I'll keep it brief, because I think Sruti has beautifully laid out why it's a very important book. Indeed, you called it the methodology, so with the design of the book and the design of the arguments, it's so well written and well thought and in a very careful way. I was thinking of slow science, because this is a potentially hot topic, queer politics. It's about the livabilities or unlivabilities and so on, but you take a step back and then you look at, actually I was thinking, what is queer here? And that's why I actually like your title very much. So it's not so much the politics of queer, but the queer politics, and then all the unexpected twists, the counterintuitive ironies, and all kinds of digressing ambiguities. It's all rather queer and unsettling. So queer beyond a particular predefined idea of what queer is, and I thought that was really helpful. And I must also admit that I do not often read a book where I really have to giggle. I mean, it's a very serious matter, and I don't mean to say that you are not being serious, but you have a particular language sometimes that you, bring in a particular wording. I forgot to write up an example that I really had to smile like, yes, nicely said. You know, things are not always do not always fit our desires, or our desire for liberation, or our desires for clear wrong and right and so on. And you have a nice way of presenting that without choosing a side or without showing your preference or somehow. So I thought that was very nice done in such a charged, with such a charged topic. So your attention to this global governmentality in relation to LGBTQ plus rights, and very much the focus on from the variety of actors, from opponents, adversaries, and the many actors in between. And basically what helped was it's beyond villains and victims, which is somehow to simplify what we often fall into when thinking of queer politics. So your aim was also to disorient the reader. And that works very well. And also that not just who is responsible for the state of affairs of homophobia, but to show a particular layeredness and so on, and to understand why is this happening right now in this particular moment of time. And as we are speaking, I do not know, but there's a similar bill being discussed in Ghana this week, but even more, well, I don't know what Graham said again, a nefarious, it is a beautiful combination of a variety of bad bills being brought to parliaments in Ghana. And of course, I immediately had to constantly think, how would your methodology would work, but the genealogy is absolutely different. So that's a very helpful way, what you also said. Your methodology is very helpful. And in Ghana, we can already see it. The history of certain things are different, particular groups of actors are different. So at the same time, we are listening to a very virulent homophobia. And yesterday we were having a meeting and it was briefly mentioned on Zoom. And then of course people were writing in the chat from Ghana, yes, while we're listening to this virulent homophobia, at the same time the same people have their relationships or queer relationships or go and look for queer sex. So these things coexist, they don't mutually exclude another. So what I really found helpful is that you refuse to take for granted the articulations between sexuality, racism, imperialism and nationalism, and how these are always historically contingent, and that we should really pay attention to these. And your approach opens a vista to investigate how queerness seems to become a signifier for many different things. So from anti-imperialism and imperialism, but also paganism and Christianity, also whiteness or embourgeoisement, briefly you mentioned that, and then subordinate caste status. So your book beautifully illuminates this shape-shifting quality of queerness. And I thought that was important, or what is seen as queer, because queer is indeed this floating signifier. So the focus on the temporality of queer politics, historicizing them, and not just contextualizing them in the sense of localizing them, but looking for the global interconnections is very insightful. For me it's very important because it avoids the trap of difference, of them over there and us here, wherever there or here is. It avoids the trap of culture, as you also explained, and it avoids a dichotomy between the global and the local, or the West and the non-West, and so on. So I would like to pick your brain on what your approach promises, maybe. The cases are Uganda, India, and the UK. And can you elaborate how your approach may be a further step in provincializing Europe, or maybe Euro-America? How does your approach enable a decentering of Euro-American production of knowledge? And also I was wondering, looking at your project, have you decentered something? And what is that? The UK, the roots of hegemonic LGBT activism, is decentering a possibility for you? And then maybe it's also a matter of language, decentering or provincializing or decolonizing, they all sound very pervasive and are very important concepts for us. But now with this experience of your book, what can you now reflect back on these large notions of what we find so important now? Your book starts from the critiquing the hegemonic grammars, but at the same, you also show that by critiquing, it also reproduces the underlying premises. So is decentering, how can you enlighten us how decentering or provincializing or decolonizing can avoid reproducing the same grammar? Because we're so caught up in it. Mm-hmm. So I was just thinking, can you maybe, it's maybe a bit of a big question, but can you share your thoughts on that? Related to that, I also thought, do you see any perspective in what is sometimes called South theorizing? There are a variety of initiatives, and next year, for example, there's a conference on Asia-Africa theorizing, where sexuality is taken as a prism to engage in a kind of theorizing from the South, or South theorizing as a way to decenter Euro-America. And I was wondering, do you see potential there, or is that maybe half-baked solution to a much complicated problem, I don't know. And yeah, that was I've got many more questions, but I think I'll leave it there and maybe in a conversation and maybe some questions from the audience as well. But thank you for a nice book.
Thank you. Can I briefly respond? Thank you, Shruti and Rachel, for those really deep questions. I want to address all of them, and I'm going to try, but I'll also try and be brief so that we can bring in the audience. So, Shruti, first your three questions. The first was on phobia. And I think you've very nicely laid out all my reservations about phobia, which I express in the book. The common sense meaning of the word suggests fear, when in fact a lot of the time when we use the word phobia, we also mean hatred. We also want to capture an affect that has, as you've mentioned, some degree of desire, some degree of self-hatred because the person desires the thing they're not supposed to desire. All of these things go into this complex cocktail that we call phobia. But the other problem with phobia for me is that it tends to individualize the affect. It becomes the moral failing of one particular individual rather than a social structure that maldistributes resources or misrecognizes people in particular ways. One of the things that I'm trying to do, and this is related to a different part of the book where we're hearing the phrase moral panics being used a lot to describe homophobia or queerphobia or transphobia in different places. And you know, Stuart Hall says this very interesting thing when he's studying moral panics in Britain in policing the crisis. He says the question is not just why do unscrupulous elites produce the kind of discourse that they do, but why are their audiences receptive to that discourse? So the challenge, I think, for us in understanding moral panics is to make intelligible why people buy that discourse without making people look stupid, right? To make that discourse intelligible, however much one disagrees with it. And that requires one to tell a much larger social story that goes well beyond the particular individual who is hateful or whatever. So that too is a reservation about phobia, that it individualizes what is really a social story. And the point about homophobia being shaped by racism, actually this is something that Gyan Maria Kolpani argues in his thesis, and I cite it in the book. And Kolpani is reading Anna Marie Smith writing about homophobia in Britain, and her argument is that the racist moral panics of the Thatcher era created a set of molds, if you like, within which subsequent hatreds took shape, which is why homophobia resembles racism in a lot of crucial ways, in the way it constructs folk devils, in the solutions it offers, in the way it appeals to audiences, and so forth. On intersectionality, the reason that this was your second question, the reason that the visual metaphor of the Mobius strip appeals to me is because, so left social theory has for the longest time been trying to think about the relationships between categories, right? In Marxism, one of the most powerful images is the base superstructure imagery, where some categories are fundamental and these generate the other categories. This gives primacy to some categories and a secondary derivative status to the others. In this liberal model of intersectionality, you have the crossroads. And there the categories are envisioned as quite separate from each other till they meet, which is not Crenshaw's argument. Her argument is that the categories are already inflected by the other categories. So the Mobius strip appealed to me because when you're tracing the surface of a Mobius strip, you cannot quite tell when one category ends, when one surface ends and the other surface begins. There's a kind of seamlessness. And of course, much of the book is trying to trace how one category becomes another in the eyes of different institutional structures. And that leads directly to your question about caste. If caste is understood as endogamy, as Ambedkar understands it, how does one then apply it to communities where heteronormative biological reproduction is not the form in which the community reproduces itself? And here I think what I'm trying to do there is actually to look at the genealogy of how transness comes to be recognized by the state as a caste. That requires us to look at the colonial census, which first categorized communities like Hijras as a caste, and not just as any caste, as a criminal caste. So this is the colonial state's gaze that has produced a certain reading of caste, which makes transness as caste intelligible to the post-colonial judiciary, even though they're doing it for an ostensibly welfarist purpose. So it's tracing a genealogy rather than arguing that these things necessarily have an intrinsic logic. That's really what I'm trying to do there. And then your question about positionality and the treatment of the different contexts. Although the Uganda, India, and Britain are not kind of side-by-side case studies in the book. Really, this is a story about colonial afterlives, and they kind of interweave with each other, and there are many points in the chapters where you can see connections, I hope, between the different contexts. Having said that, my positionality in relation to these places is very different. And, as an Indian citizen living in Britain, I felt like I could and could not say certain things about Uganda. I felt that some of the stories I encountered in Uganda were not my stories to tell. Some of the critiques were not my critiques to advance. And so I don't advance those critiques and I don't tell those stories in the book. But other people have done that work. So S.M. Rodriguez, in a very important book called The Economies of Queer Inclusion, offers a critique of the queer movement in Uganda, which suggests that some of the leadership are more beholden to fundraising and donors and external facing rather than the needs of the community itself. There are other people offering accounts of the tensions within the community in everyday life and so forth. I don't talk about any of that in the book, but I think that I cite those people and there's space for those conversations, I think, which are happening elsewhere. Rachel, thanks for your comments and questions. In a way, I'm still puzzling over the provincializing Europe question and what kind of decentering has this book done? I think it's a really important question. One kind of decentering is that I didn't think I would end up writing about Britain at all, but given my location and given the things that I was seeing happening there, it sort of felt inescapable. And it was also inescapable because sort of in the middle of the book writing process, I realized that this was a book about the afterlives of British colonialism, and to ignore Britain and what was happening in Britain would have been a sort of unforgivable lacuna. But I hope that I provincialize Europe by treating Britain as one locale, one post-colonial locale amongst others. And as much a post-colonial space or a space grappling with post-coloniality as the places that it ruled. So in that sense, it sits alongside the other locations in a place that is as consumed by these toxic legacies, albeit in a different way, albeit positioned very differently in a global political economy, etc. But it's one location among many. It also tries to decenter a kind of hegemonic queer theory which comes out of American studies by saying we need to do queer studies much more in conversation with, we need to treat the so-called areas as places that produce theory and as places where thinkers and activists are challenging theoretical norms and innovating and producing new forms of understanding. And also, in international relations, which is, believe it or not, my home discipline, although I barely read anything in it anymore, there's a lot of talk about norm production and how norms are produced and how they travel. And of course, there's a very mono-directional logic to a lot of this discussion about norm production. And I'm hoping that what I tell in the book is a much more circular story of how norms are produced. And the particular context in which that I explore, the politics of Anglican Christianity, you can see certain very key decisions being shaped by the Church of Uganda or by the sub-Saharan African clergy going to the Lambeth Conference. They are non-producers. They are not just receiving. They are in a position to reshape what the communion believes in, perhaps for the first time in the existence of that institution. Likewise, on HIV/AIDS, I try to tell a more complicated story about how the US PEPFAR program's anti-condom stance evolved. That's not just about US PEPFAR imposing policies on donor countries, on recipient countries. it's actually also a story about Ugandan conservatives preferring a particular account of why HIV/AIDS incidence declined. They wanted to tell an abstinence story rather than a condom story, and that became very central to reshaping HIV/AIDS policy as also articulated by the Bush administration. So it becomes impossible in these stories to say this is where the homophobia came from, because it's really a kind of transnational collaborative process in which, again, yes, actors are differently positioned, but brute power by itself doesn't tell you where the influence lies in these relationships. And on South-South theorizing, I think I began this book with big ambitions of bringing India into conversation with Uganda, and the irony is that I was received in both places as an academic working in Britain, which made me realize that I was not very well positioned to facilitate South-South conversations, which again are happening in different ways. You know, there's a wonderful panel where Akshay Khanna and Stella Nyanzi were in conversation with each other, and that for me is a really great instance of South-South work that was happening. And so I suppose I think I'm less, I guess I want to be a participant in those processes, but I didn't feel like I was necessarily in the best position to kind of, definitely not to lead that kind of work.
Given that we had to start a little bit later because of the technical issues, I suggest that we go on a little bit longer. I mean, if people need to leave, they need to leave, but I suggest we go on a little bit longer, right? I'm already looking at people present here. If there are questions, are there already questions in the room now? Because I want to give you both Sruti and Rahul the opportunity to continue the conversation, but I would also like to get a sense if there already are questions, or if you want to start formulating questions. There's already a question.
Whatever, I mean, if you want.
Do you first want to respond?
No,
sure. No? Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Wonderful, wonderful. I must read the book immediately. I'm very impressed by the way you bring all the people you bring together, bringing Anna Singh together with Neville Holt, and this is really very adventurous. And then intersectionality, that's really, really wonderful. I was very impressed by the labors behind haunting. That's a very nice idea, that the spirits haunt not by themselves, they need labor. What's interesting that in many parts of Africa, witchcraft is work. You have to work, somebody is working, so that it's a very powerful expression. But I was especially interested in homo-capitalism. I love homo-nationalism, being confronted with homo-capitalism. But I work mainly on Cameroon, on the issue in Cameroon, and I'm wondering whether it is working there. So you can hardly answer that question, but maybe what puzzles me extremely is that I visited Uganda very briefly, only for 1 week. I was there. I was with Stella Nyanzi, was my guide to the Shrine of the Martyrs, and she interrogated in her own special way the guide, trying to make him tell what really happened. It was quite an experience. But Uganda looked completely different from Cameroon. What the Kujus do in public life, I mean, about in public, but in the open, it's in Cameroon you would never do that. And while Uganda has the name of the black hole and the place where you never can be homosexual. And I don't see any promise of homo-capitalism for Cameroon. What the only thing that is a parallel is that there was money from the EU to gay activists to organize seminars. And that had completely the opposite effect, because then you get immediately the trope of the West is paying money to spoil our beautiful culture. Madame Com was almost killed over these seminars and all that. So is it something British, or is it, I don't know any French examples. Maybe Mozambique is an example of homo-capitalism work, in the Swiss in Mozambique certainly. But I was wondering, can you a little bit more. I love the notion. I think it's a very good notion, but how does it work in other contexts? I'm wondering. It's,
Should I respond? Or? Okay. Thanks for that question. I'm not sure I can give you I don't know enough about what's happening in Cameroon to answer it in that context, but I think as a strategy, it's, in my observation, it's mostly worked through either the inducement of the promise of growth if LGBT rights are recognized, or the stick of conditionality. Those are the two ways in which capital seems to be used to persuade for some push in LGBT rights. Now, those strategies probably won't work everywhere. They likely work in contexts where local activists are also articulating the same kind of discourse, and so they find in the World Bank a kind of powerful external patron that's also saying the same things. But the reason it appealed, the reason that it seemed to be important to me is because I saw the homo-nationalist discourse being countered very powerfully by other states, like Russia's traditional values discourse in the UN, for example, which seemed to provide an umbrella for counter-civilizationist discourses against the kind of homo-nationalist West. With homo-capitalism, it's much harder to articulate any kind of resistance to this discourse, because everybody wants to participate in a capitalist economy, except in places where you have an explicitly queer socialist or Marxist-inspired politics. And that is much harder to find in the current conjuncture, I think, in many places. There are, of course, alliances between queer groups and the left in many places, and perhaps there we can see a resistance to these kinds of discourses of assimilation. But I suppose what I'm saying is that the hegemony of capitalism is so much stronger than the hegemony of Western civilizational superiority. The story, the suggestion that if you want to be civilized, you should accept LGBT rights, is much less persuasive than if you want to be rich, you should accept LGBT rights. That's the kind of contrast that I'm trying to draw attention to. Whether it works everywhere, I'm not sure, and probably there are many places where it won't work because it may be seen as simply a version of homo-nationalism rather than. But I think what Western activists are trying to do is they're trying to shed the moral language, the moral argument, and they're trying to have this this so-called value-neutral political economy argument. Actually, in an interview, one activist I interviewed in London actually said, we can't talk about colonialism because we don't have the moral high ground. So we're going to talk about the future, we're going to talk about the economy. And that was the moment in which I thought, oh, actually these homo-nationalist logics may not work forever in all places. There are other strategies being attempted. And that made me wonder, we needed to supplement this with something else.
I'm also fascinated by your book, and like Peter, I'm definitely going to buy it tonight and read it. So, and the way you unpack certain arguments, I think fascinating. So I think it's very useful for me. As you may know, I'm writing now a history of the LGBT movement in Indonesia. So I'm sure this will be helpful. What I particularly liked is the way you unpack an issue that is now all over the world, homo-nationalism, right? Which has no relevance at all for Indonesia, no way. And it made me reflect that, I'm old, so I started by sending students into the field with Foucauldian eyes, and then I sent students into the field with Bourdieu eyes, and now we send them into the field with homo-nationalist eyes, right? I don't think that is helpful. So what is much more helpful, I think, is to look at what is there in the field, right? What is there in the particular country, the context, the history, and all that, and then look what concepts can help us. So that's what I'm trying to do, at least now, in my own book, right? But particularly now, in relation to your book, I wonder how helpful is the concept of queer at all, right?
to my mind, it was coined by a group of white Western men in San Francisco, right? And well, it has spread suddenly, and there's been some theory about it and so on. I've read most of it, so I'm familiar with these kinds of things. But to me, it is still very much a Western concept, which has been accepted by a lot of what I would call LGBT groups now, more than queer groups, right? Because what queer does is, first of all, it assumes a kind of critique, whereas some policies of LGBT groups are not critical at all. They want to belong. They don't want to criticize. They don't want to throw away the heteronormative order. They want to be accepted by the heteronormative order, right? So that's, and particularly in trans people. Secondly, what it also does is, I think it invisibilizes, well, I must use the correct terminology now, people born with, as women, as with wombs, right? Like what we call F2M transgenders. I mean, I'm close to some of the work that's been going on by FTM groups in India, and they feel totally excluded by the whole trans queer debate in India. And also in Indonesia, if I see who calls themselves queer, it's mainly gay, educated, Western educated, middle class men. The lower class women don't call themselves queer at all, right? And so who are we to impose this concept originating from San Francisco on people struggling to find a place to live, a politics in which can help them with the, well, homophobia I think is useful, around them in various ways, who try to make a living, who try to make a politics, who try to survive. I don't think queer helps us there. And also the concept, you're talking about the epistemological confusion, when we're talking about the past, which has some aspects of same-sex relations or transgender practices, right? If you approach that with the concept of homosexuality, you get nowhere, right? Because it doesn't apply, it's not used by writers about that period and from that period. So also homosexuality has its problems. And by the way, it's not only, or maybe not at all, about nostalgia that it's important to look at the past. But it's a political argument, right? The argument is, you are telling us that our tradition was always heteronormative. That's why we make all these laws to exclude you and to criminalize you, right? And then the argument is, but no, some of us were there in some practices. We've always been there. We've always belonged. It's a political argument to counter the argument of tradition. It's not because of nostalgia. People don't want to go back to kind of transgender healers and all that. But still, the fact that some healers had transgender practices helps us to see the connection with the past into the future. And that is your argument, right, out of time. So just a few comments.
Yeah, thank you. Lots of questions there, but so the book begins with a discussion of your first question. How can we use the term queer when it's obviously got an Anglo-American provenance and it has, a particular genealogy, and so one of the things I try to do is I look at the terms that Ugandan activists use themselves, kuchu, and I look at the debates that circulate around that term. And here it's very interesting because Stella Nyanzi's early anthropological work on the use of the term kuchu very interestingly shows us how that was not accepted by all people in the community in Uganda. And for some people, she says, the term was off-putting because it connoted a kind of in-your-face activism. This is the quote she uses, in-your-face activism. I'm not like that. I'm not going to call myself kuchu. What was interesting to me about that was that the term kuchu seemed to arouse the same disagreements or similar disagreements as the term queer. That doesn't mean it's the same, but it did suggest to me that all of these terms are inadequate placeholders for what we're dealing with.
Yeah, I
right?
agree with
So rather than conjuring up the perfect placeholder, I was more interested in what is the place that it is holding. Whatever word we use or words we use, what is the shape of the place that we are trying to describe? And even over that, there's no agreement. Because we try and say, oh, we're studying anti-normative behavior, but as you point out, many people want to be normative. And I think even queer theory, even Anglo-American queer theory has belatedly come to the recognition that queerness is not just about the anti-normative. Butler themselves says some norms are people need to hold on to in order to have livable lives. So I think this is an ongoing conversation, and it won't be settled by choosing the perfect language. It can only be worked through by describing the problems with language, the limits of language, the limits of representation. I mean, that's what I say at the beginning of the book, and then I have to use some words after that. So I use the words that people use for themselves, rather than anything that I, bring into it. And so the words keep shifting through the book.
Yeah. I follow the same logic.
Yeah. And on looking at the past, you're absolutely right. I recognize the political force of needing to look at the past, but the book is really looking at different ways of looking at the past. Nostalgic versus other kinds of ways of looking at the past. Ways of looking at the past that are anachronistic versus ways of looking at the past that are not. Ways of the past that are trying to be historical with a capital H versus ways of looking at the past that are more oriented, that are more memory oriented or less didactic or more subaltern or whatever. So yes, one looks at the past for political reasons, but there are all of these ways in which we can do it, and that's really what I'm trying to unpack.
Maybe one more. Is there one more question? Yeah?
Nobody else has one.
Who has one? No?
Okay, mine's not so much a question. I don't know if it's a question as a comment, and it kind of connects to the discussion that you were having a little bit with Peter and the concept of homocapitalism, which I find fascinating. And my own work is in Kyrgyzstan, and I look more at the politics of gender rather than politics around sexuality, although that's certainly a part of the broader social dynamics that I'm exploring. And in that context, so specifically looking around the politics of getting married, right, and how women get married and don't get married, and how that's used in both internal political struggles, specifically by right-wing, very kind of heteronormative nationalist movements, but also the international development. And this is the connection to your idea, as far as I understand it presented now, of homocapitalism, because there you see a similar logic to what you articulated with reference to the politics of sexuality, but in reference to the politics of gender and women and their role in, their kind of role as a symbolic reference for how developed is a country by how women get married. And I have done some research in which there are articulations of exactly this. If you would get married in a different way, if families would marry their daughters off in a different way, if they would see that their daughters are economic producers, they wouldn't marry them off in that way. They would keep them at home in order to garner more wealth for the family. So it's an argument about wealth, and it plays into discourses like you were indicating, where we're talking about questions of capitalism and these kinds of things rather than culture or the nation. But what my curiosity about this is that nonetheless at the basis of international development, because I think you referenced like the World Bank was part of the material you were using and a few other things, international development is intrinsically cannot be extricated from the nation and therefore from culture. And even if the particular person I'm speaking of was the head of UN Women in Kyrgyzstan, who articulated this comment to me about their strategies to impact marriage practices, who's also a German. And the people listening to that will never be able to unread him as a German as well, right? Or as a member of the EU. And so I'm wondering about, in homocapitalism, if you can separate the nation and the question of culture from it, whether from the perspective of those people enacting the reforms or those people who are reading them, right? And here, because Kyrgyzstan is part of the former Soviet Union, what you pointed out with Russia becomes a part of this conversation. So
yeah, thank you. That's a really important question, particularly because so Jaspreet Pawar and I are talking about homo-nationalism and homo-capitalism and how they relate to each other. I'll come to that, but just to begin where you began with with work on gender. Actually, my own thinking about what was happening here was shaped by the work of Kate Bedford on the World Bank's gender programs. And her argument is that the bank was, when the Washington Consensus came to be criticized, the bank started using gender to rehabilitate capitalism by advocating a kind of neoliberal feminism, burden sharing within the household, sort of aligning feminism with neoliberal priorities and thereby sustaining both of those things. And I think that's very much what happens with sexuality as well. It's sort of no surprise that in the very moment of austerity and global financial crisis, when these institutions were sort of being questioned in a very radical way, they were looking for new ways to position themselves as progressive agents. So that's very much part of the story I'm trying to tell. But of course, you're right that capitalism is inextricable from the nation state and the state system. And I think there are different ways of thinking about this. I think often they move in lockstep with each other, but there are some moments when they might come apart. By they, I mean the nation state and capitalism. So there's a really interesting moment in terrorist assemblages where Poir argues that when states don't recognize LGBT rights, the market offers a kind of placebo recognition to queers. And one saw this in India, where the court ruled against the anti-queer laws were challenged in court, and there were several rulings that were not progressive. And after one of these Supreme Court rulings, you saw a slew of companies advertising their products in ways that were critical of the judgment, as if to say, the state hasn't recognized you, but we, the market, will give you a home. Mm-hmm. This is an interesting moment where they come apart. So I think there are moments where they work together, moments where they come apart, and I suppose we're working towards, I think, a more complicated story of that relationship. I've been thinking of the word supplement quite a lot. Derrida uses supplement also sometimes to mean supplant. Mm. So I think both of those meanings are operative in the way we think about this relationship.
Okay, we have run out of time, even though I feel we could continue this. I hope we find other ways to continue this. One of the aims of the Research in Focus series is that after you've heard about the new research, you feel that you want to read the book, and I've already heard that people are buying the book tonight. So I hope, I hope many of you do that, and that indeed, as Rahul will be in Amsterdam for an entire year, we could actually find moments to continue some of this conversation. I would like to thank very much Rahul Rao with superior chocolate, Sruti Bala, yes, of course you too, and thank all of you here with us. It's such a pleasure to see you, actually, so many people, and thank the people who will be watching through the live stream. Thank you, and see you at one of our other events.